Do you remember those forgotten suppers? The ones you'll only find in old church cookbooks? They fed families, bonded neighbors, and made do with what little they had. What happened to the meals that once brought everyone together? Turkey croquettes with gravy were one of those elegant little tricks church ladies knew how to pull off after a holiday dinner. Leftover turkey would be shredded, mixed with a white sauce or mashed potatoes, then shaped into tidy little patties or oblong logs. Some rolled them in cracker crumbs, others used cornflake dust for the coating. Then they were fried to a golden brown and served warm with gravy poured right over the top. These were not everyday meals. They were for after Easter or Thanksgiving, when the bird had been picked clean and the bones had already gone to soup. But nothing went to waste. Not the drippings, not the stuffing, and definitely not the last bits of meat. Church cookbooks from the 1950s and 1960s are full of croquette recipes, especially in regions where thrift and grace went hand in hand. These were also popular with church auxiliary groups and potluck planners who needed something warm, filling, and presentable to serve a crowd. They looked nice on a platter, they reheated easily, and they made a little leftover go a long way. In small towns and church halls, that was always worth something. Beef and cabbage casserole was a dish you could smell down the church basement stairs long before you saw it. It started with ground beef browned in a skillet, sometimes with onion or a bit of garlic salt. Then came chopped cabbage, tomato soup, and maybe a sprinkle of rice or elbow macaroni to stretch it. All of it went into a casserole dish and baked until the top browned and the edges bubbled up. It was not fancy, but it stuck with you. In colder regions, especially during late fall suppers and Lenten fundraisers, this casserole was a dependable standby. It filled bellies fast and had that tangy sweet tomato flavor people kept coming back for. Some church ladies added Worcestershire sauce or topped it with crushed crackers. Others swore by using V8 juice instead of soup. But no matter the variation, the soul of the dish stayed the same. Cheap beef, fresh or old cabbage, and whatever starch would hold it all together. You could cook it in the morning, reheat it in the evening, and feel good about not spending much. It made its way into church cookbooks because it was a humble classic, the kind of meal that fed people well and asked for very little in return. Mock chicken legs, often called city chicken, were one of the more creative illusions that came out of old church kitchens. You would take cubes of pork or veal, thread them onto wooden skewers, bread them like fried chicken, and then either fry or bake them. They had nothing to do with chicken except for the fact that they kind of looked like a drumstick when you picked one up. This dish became a hit in the Rust Belt during the 1930s and 1940s when chicken was actually more expensive than pork. Polish and Slovak communities took to it quickly, and so did the churches they were part of. You would find the recipe in all kinds of regional cookbooks from Ohio, Pennsylvania, and Michigan. These were especially common at church picnics, potlucks, and summer weddings where trays of chicken legs would come out hot and crispy. Some cooks dipped them in gravy, others just served them plain with mashed potatoes and green beans. They were easy to make in big batches and tasted even better the next day. Church ladies loved that. It was thrifty, it was fun, and it made folks smile when they realized the chicken was not chicken at all. Ham and noodle skillet was the kind of meal that came together in a single pan on a busy Wednesday night before choir practice. It started with leftover ham, cubed, chopped, or shaved off the bone, tossed into a hot skillet with egg noodles and a handful of peas. Some folks added mushrooms, others just stirred in a spoonful of sour cream or a pat of butter to keep it rich. The result was warm, salty, and filling with just enough green to count as a vegetable. You could find this dish in nearly every Lutheran or Methodist church cookbook from the 1950s to the 1970s. It was fast, forgiving, and perfect for when dinner needed to be on the table in 20 minutes flat. No oven, no timer, just a stovetop, a wooden spoon, and a skillet. That was part of the appeal. It worked for the women who had worked all day and still had a bake sale to prep for or a committee meeting to attend. Kids ate it without complaint, and men liked it because it tasted like a meal. In homes and churches where time and money were always tight, the ham and noodle skillet got the job done. Creamed chipped ham on biscuits was the unofficial supper of Pittsburgh, and it had a way of spreading from city kitchens to country church cookbooks. It was made by chopping thin slices of deli ham, usually chipped or shredded, then simmering them in a white sauce of milk, butter, and flour. The sauce was ladled over fresh biscuits, toast, or even saltines depending on what was around. It was salty, creamy, and stuck to your ribs in the best possible way. This meal started as a working-class favorite, especially in mill towns and coal country, but it worked its way into church kitchens too. It was cheap, it was easy to scale up, and it made use of inexpensive lunch meat that could be bought by the pound. During busy weeks with lots of evening programs or youth nights, it was the kind of meal that filled a crock-pot and waited patiently until everyone was done rehearsing or cleaning pews. Church ladies appreciated how little it cost and how much it satisfied. It was also one of those dishes that made leftovers feel like something special, especially when paired with sweet pickles or stewed apples on the side. Eggplant Hamburger Pie was what happened when church ladies leaned into garden vegetables and budget beef at the same time. You would slice the eggplant thin and use it like a crust or a layer inside a pie dish, then spoon in a seasoned mix of ground beef, onion, and tomato. Some versions added breadcrumbs or a little shredded cheese on top before baking. The end result was something between a casserole and a meat pie, rich, saucy, and surprisingly light. Eggplant was never the star of church dinners, but in the right hands it carried a lot of weight. It was cheap, it soaked up flavor, and it came straight from backyard gardens during summer months. This dish was especially popular in regions with Italian or Greek congregations where Mediterranean cooking naturally found its way into church kitchens. But even in Midwest cookbooks, eggplant hamburger pie made appearances as a clever, meat-stretching recipe that helped families get through a week. It was earthy and satisfying, not too heavy, and it gave women a reason to use what they had grown without spending extra. For families who did not eat out much, this was as close as it got to something special. Bacon-topped tomato pie was one of those strange little miracles that somehow felt fancy and frugal all at once. At its core, it was sliced tomatoes, sometimes fresh from the garden, sometimes canned, layered into a pie crust with mayonnaise, shredded cheese, and a touch of onion. On top went a lattice or crumble of bacon, the kind you saved and froze in wax paper until you had enough. Then it baked until everything melted together in a warm, bubbling mess that smelled like Sunday supper. This dish was especially beloved in Southern church cookbooks, where tomatoes were plentiful and bacon was considered a sacred ingredient. Women's auxiliaries made it for luncheons, potlucks, and summer picnics when it was too hot to cook anything heavier. It walked the line between a side dish and a main course, good enough to carry a meal if needed. Sometimes it had biscuit crusts, sometimes store-bought dough, but it always had that creamy, salty sweet thing going for it. It might not have looked elegant on the plate, but people went back for seconds. That was usually all the proof a church lady needed to call it a hit. Rice ring with creamed mushrooms was the kind of supper dish that looked like it belonged on a magazine cover, but came from a 5-ingredient recipe in the back of a spiral-bound church cookbook. You would mold cooked rice, flavored with butter and maybe a bouillon cube, into a ring using a bundt pan or gelatin mold. Then you would fill the center with creamed mushrooms made from a simple white sauce and canned or fresh mushrooms sautéed in butter. It held its shape, looked impressive, and tasted warm and earthy. Dishes like this were popular for Sunday socials and women's luncheons, where the goal was to serve something filling that still had a little flair. Church ladies knew presentation mattered, especially when the ingredients were plain. Rice was cheap, mushrooms could be foraged or bought in bulk, and butter made everything feel a bit more special. This was a dish that traveled well, reheated easily, and made just enough fuss to feel intentional without being fussy. You could feed a dozen people without breaking a sweat or your grocery budget, and if there was any left, it was even better the next day. Cheesy spinach squares were what you made when you wanted to sneak something green into a potluck plate without getting too many complaints. You would mix chopped spinach, frozen or fresh, with eggs, shredded cheddar cheese, and a little flour and baking powder to bind it all together. Then it was poured into a baking dish, cooked until firm, and sliced into neat little squares. They were good warm or cold, which made them perfect for women's circles, bridal showers, and youth group meetings where you could not count on an oven being available. The flavor was mild but rich, and the texture fell somewhere between a quiche and a savory brownie. These squares were especially loved by the women who brought them because they were just so easy. No crust, no fuss, just a big mixing bowl and a square pan. They showed up in dozens of church cookbooks from the 1960s and 1970s, often with hand-scribbled notes in the margin like "add nutmeg" or "grate with hot sauce." You might not think of spinach as a crowd pleaser, but when it came baked with cheese and egg into a tidy little square, it sure had a way of disappearing fast. Barley and beef hot dish was not just dinner, it was survival food disguised as comfort. You would take ground beef, brown it with onion, and stir in pearl barley, diced tomatoes, maybe some frozen corn or green beans if you had them. Everything went into a casserole dish and baked until the barley softened and soaked up every last drop of flavor. This was a meal that stretched far, filled deep, and cost almost nothing to make. It was a regular fixture in Midwest and Prairie church cookbooks, where hot dish meant any warm, baked, one-pan meal that could carry a family through the week. Barley was one of those ingredients that folks kept on hand even if they did not cook with it often. It lasted forever and went with just about anything. When meat was scarce or expensive, barley helped bulk things out without feeling like a compromise. The beef was there for flavor, the barley for weight, and the vegetables for whatever nutrition you could scrape together. This dish fed church families, volunteer teams, and tired mothers who just needed one night off from thinking about supper. It was humble food, but it held people together. Cornmeal dumplings over stewed tomatoes were the kind of meatless meal that still filled you up and stuck to your bones. You would make the stewed tomatoes first, fresh or canned, simmered down with onion, sugar, and maybe a splash of vinegar for balance. Then you would drop spoonfuls of a cornmeal batter right on top, cover the pot, and let the steam puff them up like little yellow clouds. This was Depression-era food, no doubt about it, but it carried on through the 1940s and 1950s in Southern church kitchens. It was warm, bright, and comforting in a strange way. The cornmeal dumplings were cheap to make and stretched the tomatoes into something hearty enough to count as supper. Church ladies brought it to meatless Monday dinners or served it at home when payday was still a few days off. You would not find steak in a dish like this, but you would find a kind of quiet resilience. Even when cupboards were nearly bare, meals like this proved you could still sit down and feel taken care of. You just needed cornmeal, tomatoes, and a little bit of hope. Peanut butter and onion sandwiches might sound like a dare, but in old rural churches, they were just another kind of honest food. You would slice a sweet white onion thin, Vidalia if you had it, and layer it between two slices of bread spread thick with peanut butter. No toasting, no grilling, just straight-up lunchbox material. Sometimes people added lettuce or mustard, but most stuck to the basic version. This odd little combination came from the South and made its way into handwritten cookbooks and potluck menus, usually with a note that read, "Do not knock it till you try it." These sandwiches were common among farming families and church workers who needed protein and flavor on the cheap. And they delivered. The sweetness of the peanut butter and the bite of the onion somehow worked together, especially when paired with a glass of sweet tea or a handful of pickles. They were not gourmet, but they were quick and filled a hole. And if you happen to grow up with them, there is a good chance you still crave one when no one is watching. Creamed dried beef over rice was a salt-forward spin on a military classic that church cookbooks welcomed with open arms. This version took thin slices of dried beef, sometimes from a jar, sometimes packaged like cold cuts, and simmered them in a thick white sauce made from butter, flour, and milk. Instead of spooning it over toast, you would ladle it onto hot cooked rice, letting the sauce sink into every grain. It was richer, more filling, and gave the illusion of a meal even when the fridge was close to empty. The recipe came from war rationing and military mess halls but got dressed up for church kitchens and family tables. It was quick, pantry-friendly, and made a little beef go a long way. You could stretch it even more with peas or chopped hard-boiled eggs stirred in, which many housewives did when feeding more than 2 or 3 mouths. It was the kind of meal that said, We are making do, and we are doing it well. It is mostly forgotten now, but ask anyone who grew up on it, and they will tell you, it really did hit the spot. Mushroom-stuffed zucchini boats were the kind of creative supper dish you made when the garden was exploding and meat was nowhere in sight. You would have a zucchini lengthwise, scoop out the center, and fill it with a mixture of breadcrumbs, chopped mushroom, and maybe a little cheese or egg to hold it all together. Then you would bake it until the tops turned golden and the zucchini softened just enough to cut with a fork. This was not just about flavor. It was about making something look special when times were not. Church ladies loved how pretty they looked on a plate, especially for luncheons or potlucks where presentation counted. It was also a sneaky way to use up vegetables that were about to turn, or mushrooms that came out of a can and needed a little help. Sometimes a spoonful of tomato sauce got added on top. Sometimes the breadcrumbs were stale crackers crushed by hand. Whatever you had went in, and that was the rule. These zucchini boats sailed straight out of the garden and onto the church table with quiet pride. And for those who remember them, they were a summer supper worth repeating. Carrot and pineapple casserole might raise eyebrows today, but in old church kitchens, it was a trusted crowd pleaser. You would shred carrots fine, mix them with drained canned pineapple, sugar, eggs, and a bit of butter, then top it all with crushed Ritz crackers before baking. The result was something between a side dish and a dessert, warm, sweet, and just savory enough to sit next to a slice of ham or roast chicken. Southern church cookbooks especially loved this one. It showed up at Easter brunches, baby showers, and Wednesday night suppers. People liked it because it used simple ingredients in unexpected ways. Carrots were cheap, pineapple was shelf-stable, and crackers were almost always on hand. The casserole held its shape when sliced and looked cheerful with its orange-gold glow. Some added marshmallows. Others swore off that entirely. But no matter how you tweaked it, the base idea stayed the same. Make something warm, sweet, and comforting out of what was already in the pantry. And maybe that is why it stuck around so long, because even if it confused your taste buds, it made people smile. Cabbage and potato gratin was an understated dish that did a whole lot with very little. You would slice the potatoes and cabbage thin, layer them in a casserole dish, and pour a simple white sauce over top. Just butter, flour, milk, and salt if that was all you had. Then it baked until the top turned golden and the cabbage softened into something rich and buttery beneath the potatoes. This was not a showstopper meal. It was weekday food, the kind of thing you made when meat was out of reach, but you still needed supper on the table and something to stick with you through the night. It showed up often in church cookbooks from cold climate states where cabbage and potatoes were local staples and kept well all year. The flavors were plain, but they did not have to be fancy to feel satisfying. A sprinkle of cheese if you had it, breadcrumbs if you did not. And if you made enough, you had lunch the next day too. Dishes like this reminded people that warmth and comfort did not always cost extra. Sometimes they just took time, a little butter, and a well-used casserole pan. Rice and chicken liver bake was once a staple in kitchens that knew how to make the most of every part of the bird. You would saute chicken livers with onion and a bit of celery, stir in uncooked rice, broth, and whatever herbs you had, then bake the whole thing until the rice fluffed up and the livers turned tender. It was hearty, savory, and filled the house with a smell that some loved and others, well, got used to. Chicken liver was cheap, packed with iron, and often overlooked by those who could afford to be picky. But church families and frugal cooks knew better. They turned it into something warm and filling, especially in the Midwest and South where rice casseroles were king. The dish was often brought to potlucks or family gatherings, sometimes with a side of peas or stewed apples to lighten things up. It may not have looked glamorous, but it fed a crowd and cost next to nothing. And in communities where food was about nourishment and care more than trendiness, that was enough. You might not crave it now, but back then it was dinner. Ground Bologna salad sandwiches were one of those chilled, spreadable creations that popped up on church supper tables more often than you would think. You would take a chunk of Bologna, usually the cheap kind, run it through a meat grinder or chop it fine, then mix it with mayo, chopped pickles, and a bit of hard-boiled egg. Sometimes a spoonful of relish or mustard got added for tang, and sometimes not. The result was a creamy, meaty spread perfect for sandwich bread, saltines, or celery sticks. It was not elegant, but it was dependable. Church ladies loved it because it could be made in advance and kept cold until needed. It showed up at funeral receptions, youth nights, and sandwich socials where the goal was to feed many and spend little. Kids liked it for the mild flavor. Grown-ups liked it because it reminded them of simpler times. You would find this recipe handwritten in the margins of old cookbooks, sometimes labeled bologna spread or sandwich filler. It was humble, a little strange, and deeply familiar if you grew up around it. Just one bite and it came right back. Sweet potato and apple skillet was the kind of dish that made fall feel like a warm quilt on your lap. You would slice sweet potatoes and apples, lay them in a cast iron skillet, and cook them slowly with pork drippings, a little brown sugar, and cinnamon. The edges would caramelize while the centers turned soft and buttery. It was sweet enough to feel like dessert, but savory enough to sit next to pork chops or baked ham. This was common fare in southern church kitchens, especially during harvest dinners or homecoming meals when local produce was everywhere. Apples came from backyard trees and sweet potatoes from the garden rows. Church ladies cooked them up in big skillets passed down through generations. No baking dish, no timer, just watch and stir until it looked right. This dish was loved for its flavor and its flexibility. It could be breakfast, supper, or anything in between. And when the wind started to blow through the trees and the daylight slipped away early, it was the kind of meal that made everything feel a little more peaceful. Cottage cheese and noodle casserole was a quiet staple in church kitchens that knew how to stretch $1 without making anyone feel shortchanged. You would take cooked egg noodles and mix them with cottage cheese, eggs, butter, and a little salt and pepper. Sometimes there was sour cream, sometimes not. Then you would bake it until it set like a pudding and browned just slightly on top. It was a little tangy, a little rich, and very filling. In Jewish communities, this was known as kugel, but versions of it made their way into Christian church cookbooks throughout the Midwest. It was meatless, which made it perfect for Lent or budget nights when meat just was not going to happen. Some folks added raisins, others shredded carrots or spinach, but the base never changed. You could serve it hot or cold, and leftovers were often better the next day. It was not a flashy dish, but it always disappeared by the end of a potluck. Sometimes the best suppers were the ones that came out of a mixing bowl and a prayer. Savory bread pudding with celery and onions was not something you made to impress. It was what you made when there was stale bread, broth on hand, and mouths to feed. Cubed bread got soaked in seasoned broth or leftover gravy, then tossed with sautéed celery and onions before being baked until golden. The texture was soft inside with a crusty top, much like a stuffing but without needing a holiday as an excuse. It was often served as a side at Wednesday night potlucks, or as a light main on Lenten Fridays. Sometimes it had bits of cheese, sometimes not. It was flexible, forgiving, and made sense to people who hated waste. You would find this recipe tucked into the back pages of church cookbooks, often scribbled in with changes like, "Use mushroom soup if no broth." It was not flashy, but it was warm, satisfying, and made a quiet kind of sense. For cooks working with what they had, this dish was one more reminder that simple food can still taste like care. Shrimp and rice casserole with bell peppers was the kind of meal that felt like a small celebration on an otherwise plain weeknight. It usually started with canned or frozen shrimp, chopped bell peppers, cooked rice, and a white sauce or tomato base to hold it all together. Sometimes cheddar cheese was melted on top, but most versions kept it simple. In Gulf and coastal communities, this casserole was a church supper favorite, elegant enough to serve to guests, but easy to double for a crowd. The shrimp gave it a slight air of fancy, but it was always grounded in frugality. Families who fished brought their own catch. Others bought bags of frozen shrimp on sale. Bell peppers added color and sweetness, and the rice did the heavy lifting. This casserole was often brought to funeral meals or recovery dinners, quiet, comforting, and flavorful. It made its way into community cookbooks with little fanfare, but stayed there because it always worked. It was modest luxury baked into a 9x13 dish. Tomato aspic with hard-boiled eggs might sound like a dare today, but it once stood tall as a respected church supper dish. Made by mixing tomato juice with gelatin, celery, seasonings, and sometimes vinegar, it was poured into molds and set until firm. Sliced hard-boiled eggs were arranged inside or on top, often with a sprig of parsley or a ring of olives. It was served cold, cut into wedges or squares, and laid out next to the casseroles and ham loaf like it belonged there, which, at the time, it absolutely did. This was not dessert. It was a savory salad, and it showed up at luncheons and wedding showers across the South and Midwest. Some loved the bright tang and chilled texture. Others ate around it politely. But back then, it was seen as elegant, colorful, and even health-conscious. You would not find many fans of it now, but ask anyone who lived through the 1950s, and they will tell you. It was just what people did. Cornflake crusted baked chicken thighs were how you added crunch and comfort without using a drop of oil. Chicken thighs, bone in, skin on, were dipped in milk or beaten egg, rolled in crushed cornflakes, and baked until crisp and golden. The coating gave it that fried texture everyone loved, but it was made right in the oven, no skillet or grease needed. This recipe came from home cooks looking for thrift, and it landed in nearly every church cookbook between the 1960s and 1980s. Cornflakes were cheap, stored well, and gave leftover chicken a new lease on life. Some versions added paprika or garlic powder, others kept it plain. Either way, it was a weeknight workhorse and a potluck favorite. It tasted good hot or cold, which made it ideal for church picnics and choir practices. Kids liked the crunch, adults liked the simplicity, and everyone liked how easy it was to pull together on a budget. Ground beef and apple casserole was one of those strange, sweet-savory combinations that actually worked when it was done right. You would brown the beef with onions, layer it with sliced apples, and season the whole thing with a blend of salt, pepper, and sometimes a pinch of cinnamon or sage. Then it baked until the apples softened and the beef browned at the edges. It was not quite a pie, not quite a meatloaf, but somewhere in between. This dish showed up often in church cookbooks from the Midwest, where apples were abundant and beef was often stretched with whatever could be found. It had a rustic charm and felt like supper from another century. Sometimes breadcrumbs or oats were used to soak up the juices, other times a few potatoes filled in the gaps. You would not expect it to work, but once it was on your plate, it made quiet sense. It tasted like fall, like harvest, and like someone trying to make do with just enough. Cheddar and Onion Pie was a sharp, savory answer to the kinds of meals that had to satisfy without meat. Thinly sliced onions were cooked down until soft and golden, then layered in a pie crust with shredded cheddar cheese and beaten eggs. Once baked, the filling was creamy and rich, with a bite from the onion and a salty tang from the cheese. This pie was often served with tomato soup or sliced cucumber salad, and found its place on Lenten menus or meatless Friday tables. It was simple enough for a weeknight, but impressive enough for a church potluck. The ingredients were easy to find, and the flavors were bold enough to stand on their own. Women's auxiliaries swore by it, and it held its own alongside quiches and casseroles and hand-typed recipe collections passed around at coffee hour. It was humble but confident, and always disappeared faster than expected. Macaroni loaf with tomato glaze was how you made pasta behave like meatloaf when times got tight. Cooked elbow macaroni was mixed with beaten eggs, milk, breadcrumbs, and a bit of ground meat or cheese if you had it, then packed into a loaf pan. A glaze of ketchup or seasoned tomato sauce went on top before baking. Once cooled slightly, it could be sliced clean, like a loaf of bread, and served warm or at room temperature. It was ideal for church luncheons and picnics, sturdy, filling, and easy to portion out. This recipe was especially handy in times when pasta was cheap and meat was not. Some versions went all vegetarian, relying on spices and a heavy hand of cheese to make up the difference. It was not flashy, but it looked neat on a plate and always seemed to stretch just a little farther than expected. Savory pumpkin casserole reminded folks that pumpkin was not just for pies. Canned or fresh pumpkin got mixed with sautéed onions, sage, and breadcrumbs or crushed crackers, then baked until firm and golden. Some added grated cheese, others just let the herbs carry the flavor. This dish often showed up at fall festivals, Thanksgiving potlucks, or women's fellowship dinners where seasonal ingredients were the star. It was warm, earthy, and just a little sweet, depending on how you seasoned it. The texture was somewhere between a stuffing and a spoon bread, and it paired well with ham or roast chicken. It was thrifty, flavorful, and surprisingly cozy. Church ladies brought it to the table as a reminder that canned pumpkin could be more than dessert. Green bean and cheese puff bake was the kind of light, savory dish that snuck vegetables into the church supper lineup with a little flair. You would fold cooked green beans into a batter made from eggs, flour, milk, and shredded cheddar, then bake it until puffed and golden. The result was somewhere between a soufflé and a casserole, fluffy in the middle, cheesy at the edges, and packed with green bean flavor. It was a springtime favorite at women's luncheons, Easter brunches, and community potlucks. The ingredients were cheap, but the result looked fancy enough to impress. You could double it easily for a crowd or cut it into neat squares to serve cold. It was quiet comfort food that left a warm impression. Beef and pickle hot dish might sound odd at first, but it was a beloved staple in old Lutheran cookbooks across the Midwest. Ground beef was browned and mixed with elbow macaroni, cream of mushroom soup, and chopped dill pickles. The tang of the pickles cut through the richness, adding just enough brightness to keep things interesting. This casserole was baked until bubbly, then topped with crispy onions or crushed crackers depending on what was in the pantry. It was easy to make, easy to serve, and oddly satisfying. It fed a lot of people without needing much meat, which made it perfect for potlucks and budget nights. Once you tried it, it stuck with you. Rice-stuffed baked apples were one of those meals that towed the line between dinner and dessert. Apples stored well through winter, and rice was cheap, filling, and easy to cook. Together, they made something practical and gently sweet. You hollowed an apple, stuffed it with cooked rice, and baked it until it softened and started to collapse. If you had cinnamon or brown sugar, great. If not, a pat of lard did the trick. Some added milk to make it creamier. It was not fancy or meant to impress, but it filled stomachs and made children smile. In a time where smiles were hard to come by, that counted. These apples were often served after a bowl of soup or beans as a way to end on something soft. They warmed the kitchen and reminded folks that even hard times had gentle endings. Well, you'll ask me next, what do we do when we need rags then? If you have any shirts you don't use that don't fit, and ones you can't even pass on as hand-me-downs, then you know what to do. Use your old t-shirts as rags and repurpose them instead of going out and spending an unnecessarily high amount on a bundle pack of 5 with differently colored rags. You just need to clean filth off of the floor, and you can do that with anything. All of it is going to end up the same kind of dirty, even if one looks fresher and the other doesn't. Egg white paint for pie crust shine was the kind of kitchen trick passed down without words, just by watching someone do it. Before you had glossy photos in cookbooks or pre-made pastry shells, a good pie was known by its crust. And nothing made that crust sing like a simple swipe of beaten egg white. It gave a golden sheen, a crisp snap when bitten, and just enough polish to make it feel like a special occasion. No butter wash, no fancy glaze, just a leftover egg white, whisked and brushed on with a fingertip or scrap of cloth. It was used on both sweet and savory pies, and sometimes even on biscuits or rolls for that bakery look. You could even sprinkle sugar or seeds on top, and the egg white would help it stick. Today's recipes might tell you to use milk or yolk, but the old cooks knew egg whites gave the cleanest, crispest finish. It was quiet elegance from a cupboard that had very little to give. Before bacon strips came wrapped in plastic, there was salt pork, hearty, fatty, and packed with flavor. This was the starting point for stews, beans, and slow-cooked greens. You cut off a chunk, diced it small, and rendered it in the bottom of your pot until the fat melted and the bits turned crisp. That salty fat was liquid gold. It coated vegetables and gave every dish a depth that broth alone could not provide. Salt pork kept well without refrigeration, making it a pantry staple in both urban tenements and rural cabins. You might not eat a lot of it at once, but just a spoonful flavored a whole meal. And because it was tougher and less prized than bacon, it was cheaper too. Supermarkets phased it out in favor of neatly packaged bacon slices, but for decades, this was the backbone of American cooking. It was not glamorous, but it was reliable, and it made humble food taste big. Today, most people do not even know what it is. But ask anyone who grew up before the 1950s, and they will tell you, salt pork meant supper was on its way. Dilly Bread was a surprise hit in the 1970s. Made with cottage cheese, dried dill, and just a bit of onion, it rose soft and warm with a smell that wrapped around the kitchen like a hug. This was not sandwich bread. This was sit down and rip a piece off kind of bread. It baked in a round dish or a loaf pan, but always came out looking golden and rustic. You would slice it thick, spread it with butter, and watch it disappear. Some folks served it with soup. Others brought it to brunches or church potlucks. Betty Crocker printed it in several editions during the herb craze of the 70s, right when people were growing dill in little windowsill gardens and putting cottage cheese in everything. It was fluffy, flavorful, and full of character. Not fancy, just good. It reminded you of homemade bread without all the kneading and fuss. And once you made it once, you probably made it again. Cabbage water broth might not sound like much, but in the 1930s it was enough to keep people going. Boiling cabbage was already a regular routine, but families quickly learned to never pour the water down the drain. That cloudy, sulfur-scented liquid held nutrients, starch, and just enough flavor to turn into a soup base. Some would throw in a diced potato, a handful of onion skins, or a bit of old bread to thicken it. Others might add salt, if they had any, and call it a night. There was a kind of pride in making something from what others saw as nothing. It might not have tasted like much, but it was hot, filling, and warm on cold days when spirits were thin. In some houses, that broth became the start of a stew that would stretch out over days. You reused everything back then, especially the things no one thought to save. Even the cabbage leaves, once cooked soft and pale, might be mashed and eaten with a splash of vinegar. But the broth was the heart of it. It told a story of making do with what you had, even if it was only boiled water and scraps. It was soup born of hardship and resilience. So it was a lot easier to make one-pot meals than it was to make a starter, a main course, and something on the side for dessert. I don't mean easier as in it took less labor and effort. I mean it was a lot easier on your wallet. Why do you think casseroles were as popular as they got during the 50s and 60s? One-pot meals are a world of convenience, and you can make a meal that feeds the entire family for the whole day with minimal amounts of ingredients. Plus, if you're looking for good recipes to start with, then there's a treasure trove waiting for you in the past decades in our channel. Ketchup meat marinades were the unsung heroes of tough cuts. If the meat was chewy or on the edge of spoiling, ketchup was your best bet. Mixed with vinegar, onions, and sometimes a bit of sugar, it created a tangy brine that broke down fibers and gave the meat a richer taste. The acidity worked like magic, especially overnight in the icebox, or even just an hour before cooking. Frying or grilling after a ketchup soak gave the meat a caramelized crust and a deep savory flavor that covered up any flaws. It was a go-to for cheap steaks, pork scraps, and even liver. Some families added garlic or mustard, others kept it plain. Either way, it was dependable. You will not find this trick in high-end recipes or modern cookbooks, but it worked so well that it stayed in rotation for decades. Ketchup was more than a condiment. It was a tool. And for a lot of families, it turned subpar meat into something you actually looked forward to. Before lemon juice became the go-to, vinegar was the silent hero in every kitchen. A quick dip in diluted vinegar water could keep apple slices, pear wedges, or even peeled potatoes from browning too fast. This was especially handy when prepping ahead of time or packing lunch for school and work. The acid slowed down the oxidation process and bought you a few extra hours of freshness without needing plastic wrap or chemical sprays. For households that only had one apple left for the kids, this trick was worth its weight in gold. It made every bit stretch a little further, taste a little better, and last a little longer. Plus, vinegar was cheaper, more common, and already used for dozens of other kitchen needs: cleaning, pickling, preserving. Grocery stores do not want you to know that a bottle of vinegar can outdo half their produce-saving products. But this tiny trick gave families an edge, especially when the fruit bowl was running low and every slice had to count. It was not just thrifty, it was smart. And it is exactly the kind of thing we should be teaching again. Glorified rice had a name that felt like a joke, but people meant it. You started with cold cooked rice, folded in crushed pineapple, stirred in whipped topping, and sprinkled in marshmallows like it was going to church. Some added maraschino cherries. Others used a spoonful of fruit cocktail. It was part dessert, part side dish, and part mystery. But no one ever said no to it. You would see it at potlucks next to fried chicken or at funerals beside scalloped potatoes. It went anywhere it wanted. Sweet enough for dessert, but tame enough to sit beside ham or meatloaf. The whipped topping made it light, the pineapple made it tart, and the rice made it filling. If it sounds strange today, that is fair. But back then, it was a gentle, feel-good dish that made people smile. You could make a whole bowl of it with pantry staples and serve 10 people without blinking. It did not pretend to be glamorous. It just tried to be good. And that was more than enough. Molasses milk was poor man's cocoa, and for many families it was the closest thing to a sweet treat they could manage. All it took was a splash of hot milk, sometimes powdered, sometimes fresh, and a spoonful of molasses stirred in. The result was dark, rich, and full of iron, with a strong flavor that kids either loved or learned to tolerate. It had warmth, it had sweetness, and it came with none of the cost of chocolate, which had all but vanished from most households during the 1930s. Molasses was one of the most common sweeteners at the time because it was cheaper than sugar and had a longer shelf life. It also felt hearty, like something that was doing your body good, even if the cupboard was nearly empty. Some families drank this before bed. Others served it in place of breakfast. It was a quiet comfort, often ladled out in chipped mugs, handed off with a tired smile and a reminder to sip slowly. Molasses milk might not sound glamorous today, but back then, it tasted like safety. And that was worth more than anything else. Need to make some invitation cards? Maybe you need to send out some Christmas party invites or just make homemade cards and scrapbooks. What people would do during the Depression was reuse old magazines and craft these things out of those. It was hard to let go of hobbies, even if the times were as awful as the 1930s. But people found innovative ways to still have some creativity in their life. It's a lot more relaxing when you get to do art without worrying about money, so even if it's not for saving, even if it's just for relaxing, maybe give this a shot one day. Bread-soaked meatballs were a small act of genius hiding in plain sight. When you did not have enough breadcrumbs, or when the bread itself was too stale to eat, you soaked it in milk until it turned soft and fluffy. Then you mixed it into ground meat, herbs, and maybe an egg if you had one. The result? A tender, juicy meatball that held its shape without drying out. This trick also stretched your meat further, letting 1 pound do the work of 2. It came from Italian kitchens, but American homes embraced it fast. Sunday dinners, church potlucks, and penny-pinching mothers all used it. And it was not just for meatballs. You would see the same method in meatloaf and stuffed peppers too. The soaked bread kept things moist without adding weight. Modern recipes may call for panko or fancy crumbs, but this old trick still beats them all when it comes to comfort and thrift. Wrapping dough in newspaper may not pass modern food safety rules, but it worked just fine for generations. When plastic wrap was not yet in every drawer, people reached for what they had. Pages from the daily paper, often dusted with flour or lightly buttered. You folded it over the dough and set the bundle in a cool corner, the icebox, or even outside in the winter air. It kept the dough firm and the butter cold, which was all that mattered. This trick helped with pie crusts, cookie dough, or anything that needed resting before baking. It was not pretty, but it did the job, and it cost nothing. You used what you read that morning to bake what you would eat that night. Grocery stores would never tell you this was once normal. After all, a roll of plastic wrap makes more profit than an old newspaper ever could. But the homes that did this were not behind the times. They were just ahead of the waste. Cabbage roll casserole was Betty Crocker's way of saying, "We love stuffed cabbage, but let us not roll anything tonight." Instead of wrapping meat and rice in individual cabbage leaves, you layered everything in a baking dish: ground beef, onion, cooked rice, chopped cabbage, and tomato sauce. Then you baked it until it all settled into one soft, savory whole. It was easier, faster, and nobody had to wrestle a cabbage leaf into submission. The flavor stayed the same: hearty, slightly sweet, and rich with tomato. But the time spent in the kitchen got cut in half. This was the kind of shortcut that made its way into every Casseroles for Busy Families chapter. Some people added garlic or Worcestershire. Others just followed the basic recipe to the letter and let it speak for itself. It filled the house with the kind of smell that made you stop and close your eyes. A little tang, a little comfort, a lot of heart. That was the Betty way. Old-fashioned corn pudding was sweet, soft, and surprisingly hearty, especially for something that came from such humble beginnings. In the 1930s, cornmeal was dirt cheap and endlessly useful, and this dish was one of the cleverest ways to turn it into a filling side: a bit of cornmeal, water or milk, and just enough sugar to make it feel special. Eggs were sometimes added, but often it was just flour, grease, and corn. It came out like a custard or a thick bread pudding, depending on what you had. Baked slowly, it developed a crust on top and a warm, spoonable inside that made it a family favorite. People would eat it hot out of the oven or cold the next morning, sometimes drizzled with molasses or a pat of margarine. It was both side dish and dessert, depending on your mood. There were no store-bought sweets for most folks back then, so corn pudding gave just enough sugar and softness to count as a treat. And for children, it was a rare bite of comfort in a world where food often felt like medicine. It was poor man's pudding, but it tasted like something richer. People would also try to repurpose any old rags they didn't have any use for. You could make cleaning wipes out of them, which helped to cut down on groceries. The thing about a lot of these tricks is that they sound bizarre and like a lot of budgeting with extra steps at first, but try doing it on your own groceries. You'll find that you can't skimp out on the important stuff. What tricks like this do is they create more money for that stuff, and make sure that the little bit you do have left over actually gets a chance to accumulate and pile up. Plus, they're just wipes, they do the job well enough. Cast iron lid baking was born out of necessity and kept alive by sheer determination. When families had no access to an oven, or when it was too hot to fire one up, they made do with what they had. And what they had was a heavy cast iron pot, usually with a domed lid. Flip that lid over, set it on a flame, and you had a perfectly usable griddle surface for baking bannock, soda bread, or flat cakes. Some folks even propped up the lid with bricks and piled coals on top to create an improvised oven. It took practice to keep the heat even, but the reward was hot bread on a day you thought there would be none. This method showed up in everything from log cabins to war kitchens, and it never let people down. Cast iron held heat like nothing else, and when times got tough, it doubled as bakeware, skillet, and roasting pan. The lid was more than a cover, it was a secret weapon. These tricks rarely appear in modern books, but they kept people fed for generations. Grating cold butter into pastry dough may sound like a modern baking hack, but it is older than most kitchen gadgets you will ever own. Before food processors or electric mixers, people used their hands, knives, or box graters to work butter into flour, especially when making pie crusts or biscuits. The trick was to keep the butter as cold as possible so it did not melt into the flour. Grated butter created little pockets in the dough, and when baked, those pockets turned into flake after buttery flake. It made crusts lighter, layers crisper, and the end result far more satisfying. Best of all, it was cheap and easy. No need for a fancy kitchen tool or a prepackaged mix, just butter, a grater, and a little elbow grease. It kept the dough tender, and it gave bakers more control over texture without overworking the mix. Grocery stores have long since replaced this kind of kitchen knowledge with ready-made pie crusts in plastic tubes. But the folks who knew how to do this by hand got results that no store-bought shortcut could match. This was precision, learned in warm kitchens long before appliances did the work. You could smell the vinegar before you even saw it. Tomato aspic ring with cottage cheese center was one of those gelatin recipes that made you pause and squint. Made with tomato juice, lemon, a touch of spice, and unflavored gelatin, it set into a firm, glossy mold that looked more like art than food. Right in the center, a cold scoop of cottage cheese sat like a prize. It was chilled, sliced, and served with parsley or maybe a sprig of celery leaf if you were fancy. This dish was all about appearances. It looked organized, clean, respectable, and people loved it. Not because it was delicious necessarily, but because it was reliable. It held its shape. It stood tall on the plate, and it came straight from the Betty Crocker playbook of mid-century hospitality. Some people added olives or celery bits. Others swore by a dash of Worcestershire sauce. Either way, it was a staple at luncheons and ladies' club meetings, a showpiece more than a craving. It might not be your favorite dish now, but back then, it meant you had taste, or at least a good mold. If you limit your meat consumption like people did back then, you'll find yourself saving a lot of money. You have to think about it like this. Would you, as you are today, or would the people we know today survive the Depression? No. People back then were the very definition of frugal, and they knew how to stretch the life out of every single dollar in grocery. Limiting meat consumption meant that people were saving more not just on food, but also on medical expenses, since they were getting healthier and stronger immune systems at the same time too. It's literally two massive money-sucking birds with one serving of celery. Jelly omelets were the kind of oddball Depression dish that worked better than expected. Eggs were easier to get than meat, especially if you had chickens, but they still had to stretch. So when there was no bacon or sausage, people got creative. They spread jam or jelly inside a folded omelet and served it like breakfast dessert. Grape, apple, strawberry, whatever you had, often homemade and preserved. It was sweet, soft, and oddly satisfying. The egg and sugar made something that felt like a treat, even if it was born of necessity. For children, it was special. For adults, it was just another way to avoid waste. You could swap in stewed fruit or mashed banana if jelly was gone. It was quick, flexible, and checked every box for a Depression meal. It might seem strange today, but it made sense back then. When food was limited, taste mattered more than rules. Before plastic wrap or foil, pies were protected in a different way, by a simple damp cloth. After baking, families would drape a clean, slightly moistened kitchen towel over the pie to keep it from drying out or attracting flies. It was a trick passed down quietly, never written on a box or sold in stores. The cloth kept in moisture, cooled the filling slowly, and even helped the crust stay flaky without getting tough. For households without refrigerators, this was essential. Pies were left on windowsills or countertops, and the cloth did all the work. No packaging, no preservatives, just common sense. And it worked. If someone came by for a slice, you lifted the cloth like a curtain and served it warm. Today, we cover everything in layers of plastic, but back then, the kitchen towel was the only seal you needed. It was clean, reusable, and did not cost a thing. Grocery stores do not sell damp cloths for pie because there is no profit in that. But it is one more forgotten detail from a time when food was made with care and kept that way. Golden Glow salad was as cheerful as it sounds. A molded salad made from orange or lemon gelatin, finely shredded carrots, and crushed pineapple, it was Betty's answer to healthy eating that still jiggled. It showed up on dinner plates and potluck tables, sitting tall in ring molds or scooped onto a leaf of iceberg lettuce. This was not dessert. It was salad. The carrots gave it crunch, the pineapple gave it sweetness, and the gelatin made it behave. You could make it a day ahead and forget about it until dinner time. Some people topped it with a spoonful of mayonnaise, others left it plain with just a sprinkle of chopped nuts. It was light, refreshing, and surprisingly popular during the 1960s and 1970s when people wanted to feel like they were eating better, even if it was still wrapped in Jell-O. It was not trying to impress. It was just trying to brighten your plate. And for a lot of people, it did. Flour and salt meat stretchers were not about taste. They were about survival and smart thinking. When a pound of meat had to feed 6 or 7 people, there was no room for waste. Home cooks would mix the meat with a cup or 2 of flour, sometimes seasoned with pepper or dried herbs, and add a heavy pinch of salt. That mixture got turned into patties, crumbles, or meatballs. The flour made it stick together, and the salt helped pull out the flavor from the scraps of beef or pork. Sometimes an egg was added, sometimes not. Fried in a pan or baked in a loaf tin, it held its shape and filled the plate. Kids did not ask what was in it. They were just glad to have a warm dinner with something meaty at the center. These stretchers kept food on the table long after the groceries had run out. You will not find this trick in today's glossy cookbooks. Nobody wants to admit that flour can make meat go twice as far, but ask anyone who lived through the hard years, and they will tell you it was a trick worth knowing. You don't actually need to go to Shein for every shopping haul. It's so much more affordable to buy generic brands or local brands from designers and small businesses instead of overpriced thrifted articles that they've either gotten from some really questionable labor or what they've bought from the same people I'm talking about, but are now reselling at, like, thrice the price. It's a death trap. And I like you, viewer. I don't want you falling for it any more than you and I already have. Trust me, you'll still look just as good, if not better. Wilted lettuce salad was not just about saving soggy greens. It was about making the most of what the garden gave, even past its prime. When lettuce started to wilt in the heat or after a few days indoors, families did not toss it. Instead, they poured hot bacon grease mixed with vinegar over the top, reviving the leaves into something tender and flavorful. The heat wilted the lettuce just enough, and the vinegar gave it a punch of brightness. Bits of onion or crumbled bacon were added when possible, but the core of the dish was that sizzling pour. It turned tired lettuce into a warm salad with more depth than any cold dressing could offer. You did not need much to make it feel special. It was a moment when something old felt new again. In a time of extreme frugality, it captured the mindset perfectly. Do not throw it out. Just use it differently. Wilted lettuce was not a fallback. It was a quiet trick that helped people feel like they still had a choice at the table. When a block of cheese was almost gone, you did not throw out the rind. You saved it, because that tough edge held the last of the flavor. Hard cheeses like Parmesan or aged cheddar were expensive, and families learned to use every last bit. The rind was dropped into bubbling soup pots or saucepans, where it would slowly soften and melt just enough to release its salty richness. You did not need meat or bones when a single cheese rind could transform a pot of beans or a simple tomato broth. It was thrift that tasted like luxury, and once the rind gave all it could, you fished it out and tossed it, nothing left to offer. Today, cheese rinds get sliced off and tossed in the trash without a second thought, but back then, it was understood that flavor lived in every part of the food. This was one of those quiet tricks that stretched your pantry and made meals feel richer than they were. Supermarkets do not remind you of this one, maybe because it means fewer blocks of cheese in your cart. You knew it was dinner time in the 1970s when you saw hot dogs sticking out of mashed potatoes like they owned the place. Hot dog crown casserole was loud, fun, and made almost entirely of leftovers. Mashed potatoes formed the base, with a mix of canned vegetables hidden underneath. Then came the crown. Sliced hot dogs arranged in a circle like spokes on a wheel, ready to be browned under the broiler. It was part casserole, part sculpture, and it was kid-approved before that was even a marketing term. You might laugh now, but this was dinner theater back then. It used what was on hand, cost next to nothing, and gave kids a reason to actually eat vegetables. You could even find the recipe printed in the Kids Can Cook section of Betty's cookbooks. And while modern food blogs might call it kitschy, people back then called it Tuesday. It was filling, it was silly, and it got the job done. Have you ever heard of using cloth napkins and towels? They might not feel as good as the paper products we're used to and have been familiar with since the, start of our lives, but they do save a pretty penny. The thing is, all of this is a lifestyle choice. These little tips and tricks on their own might not add too much, but you buy the cloth napkin, you make the snack at home, you make a DIY detergent, and you start to see enough money bubbling up in your account at month's end. Eventually. Drop your favorite forgotten supper in the comments, tap like if it made you smile, and subscribe for more recipes that time almost left behind.